can act or speak in this way is beyond me, and I hope, ladies and gentlemen, far beyond you and far beneath your contempt. Thank you.
George Galloway, your response.
Well, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, slobbering was the note that Mr. Hitchens chose to end on. I'm not sure that was wise.
Bring it on.
But I want to begin by praising Mr. Hitchens. In Dundee, my home city, at the annual delegate meeting of the National Union of Journalists 25 years ago, the same Mr. Hitchens made a speech in which he praised me and the City Council for what he described as its brave act of twinning the city of Dundee with the Palestinian city of Nablus. He said...
No. Must have been someone else.
He said that it was... I didn't interrupt you, so perhaps you'll not slobber over my remarks.
Someone else.
You see, it was very important, Mr. Hitchens' support for the Palestinian people, and it was not easy in 1980. Only a few years before, the Palestinian resistance had seized the Israeli Olympic Games team in Munich and had committed what most people in the world described as an act of mass terrorism. Mr. Hitchens' courageous stand with groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the hijackers of many an aircraft, the carrying out of many a military operation, was very significant because it was very rare. Equally, I want to thank Mr. Hitchens for the brave stand that he made against the war on Iraq in 1991. I want to say, and I've never had the chance to thank him for this, one of the magic moments of that great era was Christopher Hitchens on television with the gun nut Charlton Heston. When Heston was fulminating, desperate to get in there, desperate to attack, Hitchens told him to keep his wig on, and then he asked him, magically, to name 4 countries with a border with the country he was so keen to invade. And Heston, of course, could name none. That was important because it was very difficult to oppose the war against Iraq in 1991. After all, it was ruled by somebody called Saddam Hussein. It was governed by the Ba'ath Party, who continued to govern it thereafter. It was only 3 years since those chemical weapons that Mr. Hitchens could still smell when he was last there had been launched against the Kurdish people whom he will never leave alone. Only 3 years before Halabja had taken place. And of course, perhaps most significantly of all, it was difficult to oppose that attack on Iraq in 1991 because Iraq had invaded and abolished, to quote him a few minutes ago, a member state of the Arab League of the United Nations, a Muslim Arab country. Notwithstanding all of these things, Mr. Hitchens bravely, fanatically you may say, stood against the idea of President George Bush invading Iraq in 1991. What you have witnessed since is something unique in natural history. The first ever metamorphosis from a butterfly back into a slug.
Not bad.
And I mention slug purposefully because the one thing a slug does leave behind it is a trail of slime. Now, I was brought up by my father on the principle never to wrestle with a chimney sweep, because whatever you do, you can't come out clean. But you, Mr. Hitchens, are no chimney sweep. That's not coal dust in which you are covered. You are covered in the stuff you like to smear onto others. Not just me, with your Goebbelian leaflets full of selective quotation, half-truth, mistruth, and downright untruth, and the comments you made in your last 2 minutes of this speech. But people much more gentle than me, people like Cindy Sheehan, whom you described as a sob sister, as a flake, as a LaRouche, a woman who gave the life of her son for the war that you have come here to glory in. People like Mr. Hitchens are ready to fight to the last drop of other people's blood, and it's utterly contemptible, utterly and completely contemptible. Now, Hitchens makes much, and I know that he will in his next segment, so I shall, to coin a phrase, preempt it, of the nature and character of those resisting the foreign invasion and occupation in Iraq. I spoke last night in Boston, in a hall where many of the leaders of the great American Revolution stood and spoke. My favourite member of the British Parliament has a statue. It's the first one you meet as you walk in St. Stephen's entry. It is a statue of Charles James Fox. He was expelled twice from Parliament for supporting the American Revolution and supporting the French Revolution. Now, some might say Fox was wrong supporting the anti-colonial struggle of the American people. After all, some might say, better be careful what you wish for, Charlie. Maybe one day that independent free country you're supporting the birth of will be ruled by crazed fundamentalists like Pat Robertson and George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Michael Ashcroft. They might have said, be careful, Charlie. If this country becomes free, it might one day not even be able to pick up the dead bodies in one of its most important cities a week after they've lain there. Such is the malevolence and incompetence of the government which will rule it. But Fox would have said no. Fox would have said no. He would have said the American people have a right to be free. Who they choose to rule them is a matter for them. Let them make their mistakes. Let them have their own politics. My country has no right to occupy them any further. Now, I am of Irish background myself. When the Irish people rose in 1916 for their freedom to strike one of the first decisive blows against the British Empire, on which the sun never set, because God would never trust the English in the dark. When the Irish people rose, the Hitchens of those days in Bloomsbury, in the salons, denounced the Irish rebels as priest-ridden, bog-trotting, Celtic, Gaelic obscurantists to whom they would never issue from Bloomsbury a certificate of approval. But the only certificate of approval that mattered was the one issued by the Irish people, not the Liberals in London who refused to endorse it. My point is this. For us in the United States and the United Kingdom, there is only one big question. Mr. Bush actually framed it for us. Are you with the foreign occupation of Iraq, or are you with the right of the Iraqi people to be free and to resist the foreign armies who have violently invaded them? And that's why that cheap demagoguery by Hitchens at the beginning of this debate got the risible response that it did from this audience. Because he wants you to make a minute's silence for the 145 today. But he can't bring himself to mention the massacre in Tal Afar over the last 4 days in Iraq. He doesn't want to know about the massacre in Fallujah when the American armed forces, brick by brick, destroyed a city and massacred thousands of people. Now this debate, as Amy Goodman said, is taking place at a very important time on a very important subject. This war in which he glories, although how I wish he'd put on a tin hat and pick up a gun and go and fight himself. How I wish to see that sight. This war in which he glories has cost the lives, according to those well-known Saddamist fronts, The Lancet and Johns Hopkins University, well in excess of 100,000 people's lives, and hundreds of thousands more have been maimed and wounded. And it was all for a pack of lies. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no link between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. There was no link between Iraq and the atrocities on the 9th of September, on the 9/11 here in the United States. There was no welcome for the foreign armies that invaded Iraq. Hitchens said they would be greeted by flowers, but there are 2,000 young American boys lying in the ground now, testimony to the fact that they were welcomed by something else. And thousands more wounded, maimed, many of them in wheelchairs for the rest of their lives, testament to the folly of Hitchens and Bush and Cheney and the rest of the neocon gang that dragged your country into this disaster. The international legal and political system has been defaced and disfigured. The world has been made a more dangerous place, not just for us, but for our children and their children, for generations to come. The world has been made a more dangerous place. Hitchens asked us to believe that hundreds of thousands of Western soldiers invading a Muslim country would make less Islamist fundamentalism. He asked us to believe that devastating Iraq and making a Yugoslavia on top of the world's biggest oil field would make the world a safer and more stable place. There is scarcely a sentient being in the land who any longer believes that the war on Iraq was either necessary or just or a good idea. Now, you may very well ask why so many people wanted to come in here and watch and listen to two British guys debating in the United States of America about a war far away. I think the reason is this. Our two countries are the biggest rogue states in the world today. And it is therefore vitally important it is therefore vitally important that those who oppose the crimes of our governments on both sides of the Atlantic link hands, link arms, stand shoulder to shoulder until we've rid the world of George W. Bush and Anthony Blair once and for all. Thank you very much.
Christopher Hitchens.